Hello, my name is Michelle. Welcome to my channel, Michelle's Melancholia. The human mind searches for cause and effect, always, and we all prefer the weird and thrilling to the dull and commonplace as an answer. In today's video, I will be reviewing / just talking about two books, and I'm going to do this video a little bit differently because instead of reviewing first one book and then the other, what I'm going to do is kind of like review them both at the same time, switching between one and the other. And let me explain to you the reason why I have decided to do it this way. I think I have mentioned before that on Instagram I am in a book club called the Classic Horror Crew, in which we read classic horror books. And if you're interested in that, that is organized by Paul at Pizza Planeteer. And sometime last year we read this book, which is The Body Snatchers by Jack Finney. And last month I decided to read this other book, which is I Am Legend by Richard Matheson. So when I brought home the second book, I obviously wanted to put it in the section where I have these editions of the science fiction masterworks, and I put it right next to The Body Snatchers. And I realized that the covers are kind of similar, because they both feature these kind of like creepy faces, and they're both kind of like featureless, kind of like in this hazy background, and I thought they looked really cool together. And the more I stared at them, the more I realized that actually these two books are very similar in many ways, and that's the reason I wanted to go back and forth between them and review them together. Evidently, to begin with, these are both classic science fiction stories that have horror elements in it. So I would say they are a hybrid between horror and science fiction. Another interesting thing is that they were both published around the same time. If I remember correctly, this one was first published in 1954 and this one in 1955, so within a year of each other. And of course, they have both been adapted into movies. I don't think I have watched the movie for I Am Legend, and if I have, I frankly don't remember at all. But I actually will be discussing it because even though I haven't watched it, I have thoughts, but we will get into that later. And because I really liked this book, I tried watching the movie. It actually has like 3 different movie adaptations, and I tried watching the one made in the 70s because that was supposed to be the best one, but I fell asleep because I was so bored. So yeah, if you really like the book, maybe you'd enjoy the movie, but to me it didn't really convey the essence of what I got from in the book. And lastly, and perhaps most importantly, they both imagine a world that has been overtaken by non-human creatures, and there is a main character that is trying to survive. And in order to survive, they are trying to understand what has caused these creatures to basically take over the earth, and trying to find out from a scientific perspective how to defeat them. So of course, in both of these books, the monsters or the invaders are the main source of conflict for the storyline. As it is quite obvious from the title, in this book, the creatures are body snatchers. So these are creatures that arrive to the earth from outer space, and I think they're some kind of spore that turns into like a pod, like a plant pod, like a pea pod or something like that. And what they do is that they create an exact replica of a human body, and then the original body, I think it disappears. So that's why it's called the body snatchers, because basically they steal the body from people. In I Am Legend, well, as it's written on the tagline, it is the most clever and riveting vampire novel since Dracula. So I think it is a very loose definition of vampires or vampirism. I think they can definitely be called vampires because they do fulfill the traditional requirements for being vampires, as in they cannot go out in the daylight, they are low tolerance to garlic, and they are killed by using stakes. I think these ones don't have that thing where you cannot come into a house unless you're invited. I think they could just walk up and go anywhere. But I think like you could say they're vampires in that sense. Also, I mean, I think I forgot the main characteristic of vampires, which is they drink blood. So they do drink blood. What I thought was a bit confusing about this one is that there's apparently two types of vampires. There's like the dead vampires, which is essentially reanimated corpses. So this is people who have died and then their bodies reanimate and they are just looking for blood. But I don't think these type of vampires retain like any of their human personality. And there's like another type of vampire which became vampires before dying. So I think they are alive and they are themselves, but now they have turned into a vampire. Yeah, it wasn't really clear, to be honest, how each of those groups of vampires come to be. But I think, yeah, it's part of the story trying to figure this out. As I mentioned earlier, in each of these books we have one main character who takes it upon themselves to figure out what is going on and trying to get rid of these invaders. In the Body Snatchers, we have Dr. Miles Bennell, and he is a medical doctor. And how the story gets going is that one day he's at his medical practice when his friend Becky shows up, and she comes to him and tells him that she is certain that a member of her family is not really that member of the family. And she can't really explain what it is. She says that they look exactly the same, they act exactly the same, they are indistinguishable in any way, but somehow she just knows that they are not that person. But then more and more people start coming into the office telling him the exact same thing. And that's when he starts to think that something wrong is happening. However, he is a general physician, so he says like, you know what, this is, I'm out of my depth. This is not what I'm an expert in. I have no idea what's going on. So in order to get advice, he contacts another doctor friend of his who is a psychiatrist, because he thinks that basically these people are having psychiatric issues. And Dr. Miles, I found him to be a great character. He's very likable, he's kind of like charming, and I really enjoyed his scientific approach to the issue and how he really took every piece of information he took it to its logical conclusion in order to solve the mystery. And I also really enjoyed his relationship with Becky. So basically, Becky's like his old friend, but clearly there is some kind of romance going on there. And I usually don't like books that have like romance just that has not much to do with the story. But these ones, it was actually kind of like charming. Of course, it's outdated in that Becky is a bit like helpless, and she's like, oh no, lady in distress, and Dr. Miles comes to the rescue. But they were quite cute together, and she also ends up being quite brave in the end. So yeah, it was really nice to follow this character around. On the other hand, in I Am Legend, we follow Robert Neville. And Robert Neville, he is basically the last man standing. So whereas here we follow the story from the beginning of the invasion, here we start at a point in time where the world has been taken over, and Robert is the last person left. And he's kind of like, well, he's incommunicated, so he doesn't know if there's other people around, but he's on his own. So he has barricaded himself in his home, and he's just like trying to survive. But oh my god, this guy, yeah, he's how do you say in English, insoportable? He's insufferable. He is kind of like bad tempered, so he will be working on some problem that's necessary for his survival, and then he will throw a tantrum and destroy the whole thing. He's just like drinking all the time, which I mean, maybe I'm not giving him enough grace. I mean, he is in a pretty bad position, but in general, he made me very frustrated. And the other thing that I didn't like is that he basically describes how the female vampires just kind of like try to lure him out of the house by tempting him with their bodies, and he's like, oh, how will I ever resist? And I'm like, I mean, just don't. Yeah, I don't know, he wasn't very likable. But that being said, I did like his approach to trying to figure out how to get rid of the vampires. So, of course, as we all know, when something happens on planet Earth that threatens the survival of humanity, the best course of action to ensure we don't all die is to do our best to understand what the threat actually is, so we can actually come up with a plan to solve the issue. So that's what our protagonists do in these two books. As I mentioned in The Body Snatchers, Dr. Miles really has a scientific mind, and before anything, he tries to come up with a scientific explanation on what could be going on. So he asks his psychiatrist friend, and that friend is like, oh, you know what? I think this is a case of mass hysteria, which is when like a bunch of people, for some reason, report the same symptoms or experience with no evident explanation. So, you know, it's like that thing that supposedly happened in the Middle Ages when people just start dancing and they couldn't stop, and they kept dancing until they died, and they couldn't really explain why they were doing it, but they were all doing it. So he says it's that. But instead of dancing with this thing called Capgras delusion, which is an actual condition that people sometimes show when they think that their loved ones are not really who they say they are, and they're like imposters. So he says probably it's a case of that a bunch of people in this town have been showing this delusion, and yeah, that's just a medical condition. But then what happens is that another person in the town calls the doctor, and he tells him that he should come to his house that night because they have to show him something. And basically what they show him is the actual body snatcher creatures, or at least some I mean, not the creatures themselves, but definitely physical evidence that something is taking over people's bodies. Once the doctor encounters the physical evidence, he kind of thinks, well, this is crazy. It's really not an explanation I would have ever expected to have to believe, but given the evidence, I have no choice. I must believe that there is something else going on. And of course, then they try different things, doing kind of like experiments to figure out how the body snatchers actually take the bodies from the people. And we consistently improve our understanding of how these creatures operate throughout the book, which is really good because then that ties up the story very neatly in the end. In I Am Legend, as I mentioned, the story starts where vampires are already a thing and Robert is the only man left. So there is no doubt at this point that the vampires are vampires. But of course, Robert is still interested in finding out why they have become like they are. And so as I said, I didn't watch the movie, but I did go on the Wikipedia page and read the whole synopsis because I wanted to know how it was similar and how it was different. And I think in the movie, Robert, before the whole thing happened, he was already a scientist. He was like a researcher or something. Whereas in the book, he's just a regular man. And he starts thinking that this is some kind of infection, which is, of course, like, if you don't believe in vampires, it's perhaps the first explanation that comes to mind, that it must be a disease and that these people are getting infected. And that turns out to be the case, although we don't get too many details on how that works. And I think that's fine, because I don't think you can make it like super believable, so maybe it was fine to just leave some open questions. What I thought was kind of cool is that in order to carry out his research during the day when the vampires are hiding away, he goes to the public library and first he steals a microscope, and then he takes a microscope home, and then he's like, I know nothing about microscopy, I know nothing about like virology or bacteriology or anything. So he goes every day to the library and just takes books and then studies. Which was very interesting. And also he carries out experiments. So for example, he has noticed that the vampires shy away from garlic, so he during the day he takes some blood sample from one of the vampires, and then he puts it under the microscope, and then he adds like garlic, and then he tries to see what the effect is, etc., etc. Eventually he figures out that it's not that you need a stake. I think you just need to like destroy the heart, or I don't remember the details, but essentially one of the things that he thought was required, and that actually is a characteristic of being a vampire, was more of like a superstition, and in reality there was an alternative explanation for why they appeared to be this way. So that whole process, I think, was extremely, extremely interesting. Although I did get frustrated, because then he would throw a tantrum and throw the microscope and break his slides with the blood, and it was all very dramatic. So far, I have spoken about commonalities between the characters and the plots of these two books, but as you may have noticed, there is a theme that pops out that is also shared between both of them, and that is the fear of the other, especially when we don't really know who that other is, or they are different from what we perceive as humanity. And I won't attempt to make an in-depth literary analysis of the books, because I'm sure there's plenty of that out there. But obviously, given the time in which they were written and published, one of the most accepted interpretations is that they reflect like the nervousness around the Cold War and basically being overtaken by communism. But I would say in general, it's a fear that prevails in current times, and that is just by the fear of being displaced by a group of individuals that we perceive to be the other, or perceive to be different to who we are. And the point is that in both of these books, the two species can't really coexist. One replaces the other, and that's what makes it scary. And all of this becomes especially clear when we are approaching the ending of the stories, because in the Body Snatchers, when Becky and Dr. Miles finally are able to establish communication with the alien creatures, these creatures tell them that they are not doing anything out of the ordinary, they are not evil, they are just trying to survive. So basically how they survive is, or how they manage to reproduce, is by going to other planets and taking over the organic matter in that planet, and that is just their form of survival. And they actually mention to them that they shouldn't be so surprised, because humans displace other creatures all the time and take over their habitats, and if humans do it all the time, it's no different to aliens doing it. But of course, as humans, we don't like it when we are the ones being displaced. And a similar thing ends up happening in I Am Legend. As I mentioned early in the video, there are some vampires that actually never died. They just became infected, but they are alive and they are themselves. And we discovered that they are like people. They communicate with each other and they are also trying to survive. So in none of these cases there is an actual villain. The conflict comes from the inability of humans and creatures to coexist with each other, and only one can prevail. And of course, each one of the species wants their own survival. Now I will talk about the ending. So if you haven't read the books and you don't want to know what happens in the end, just feel free to skip this part. Basically what happens at the end is that Dr. Miles and Becky, they put up a fight. So I really enjoyed this the later part of the book because there's a lot of action, there is a lot of tension. It's quite scary. You're really rooting for the characters and they have to go up against these creatures. And what happens is that they discover that in a field, well, there's a huge field where the aliens are growing their pods. So they set them on fire. And they're thinking that maybe they cannot completely get rid of every single pod, but they are going to try their best to just slow them down. But then the aliens, when they see that much pushback, they basically tell them that what they're trying to do is to survive and reproduce. But given that humans are putting up such a fight, that it's too much effort. It's too much effort to keep trying to reproduce on planet Earth, so that they're just gonna go somewhere else. And yeah, that's it. It's basically a happy ending. I don't know, in terms of like historical context, especially talking about the fear of communism, maybe there was a hidden message there that just went over my head. So let me know if you think that this was any kind of was it a message? Do you think they were trying to tell the reader something about fighting back communism? I don't know. I just took it as a happy ending, and Dr. Miles and Becky lived happily ever after. What I thought was quite cute is that right at the very end, basically it's Dr. Miles narrating the story, and at the very, very end, he says how sometimes he starts to even doubt himself and starts to think whether what happened actually happened, or if his own mind is deceiving itself and just creating this unbelievable story to kind of like cope with something else, I suppose. But I think it's just like part of his character, because obviously being a doctor and being a man of science, it's really hard for him to reconcile everything he believes about logic and the order of the universe with something that seems to be completely impossible. So yeah, I thought the ending of this one, I mean, it was a happy ending, which is not my favorite kind of ending, but in general it was very strong. Now let's talk about the ending of I Am Legend, because I have heard, and from the reviews I read on Goodreads, etc., a lot of people don't like the ending. And I'm sorry, but I don't understand that, because for me this was kind of like a 3, maybe 2-star read, and not because I thought the story was bad, but as I said, I rate based on my personal enjoyment, and because I could not stand the main character, I was not having the best time. However, once the ending rolls around, once I read the last sentence of the book, I was like, oh, and I got really excited because I felt like the whole point of the book was just condensed into that last period, and that's when I was like, oh, this book is actually great. And of course, when I searched for the movie synopsis on Wikipedia, I saw that they changed the ending. So basically in the movie, Robert Neville, with his scientific research, he finds a way to get rid of the vampires, and he finds a cure. He finds a cure for vampirism, so all these people that were infected, he cures them, and then there's no more vampires, and then he gets told that because he figured out how to solve these giant worldwide crises, now he's a legend. And I was like, does that really happen in the movie? Because oh my god, did I miss the point? If you know the ending of the book, you will know that what happens is basically the complete opposite. Robert comes in contact with some of the alive vampires, and he finds out that they have formed their own society, but they have come to realize that any humans that are left in the world are trying to kill them, and of course they want to survive, and they realize that this is a case of it's either them or us. So they decide that they are going to have to eliminate the remaining humans, and one of them is Robert. So basically, that's what happens. Robert gets captured by the vampires, and then he dies. And his last thoughts while he's dying, well, I think he's like in an operation room or something, and he's looking through the glass and he sees that there's like a bunch of vampires, and he starts to think, well, they are the main species inhabiting Earth now, and if I'm not the last human, I'm probably one of the last, and humans will basically go extinct. And that's when he realizes that even though vampires used to be a thing of legend, eventually humans will now become legend, because it will be like a story that was told, like, you know, these creatures used to exist but now they're gone and no one will have ever seen one. So he now is the legend. So that to me condensed the whole message of the whole book, and it made the whole book worth reading. And just to think that they changed that in the movie, why would they do that? So to summarize, I thought that both of these books were really interesting examinations of humanity's fear of the other or the invader, but they both take it one step further and examine how we would react to the realization that we are actually not that different from that creature we are so afraid of. Now, personally, I think if I had to battle them against each other, I slightly prefer the Body Snatchers, just because I had a great time reading it. And I loved Dr. Miles as a character, as a doctor, as a scientist. It was incredibly fun to read from his perspective. But I would say that if you love science fiction or you love horror and you haven't read any of these books, I would highly recommend that you do. If you have read them and have a favorite, please let me know if you agreed with me or not, or in general tell me, are you more afraid of aliens or vampires, or do you prefer one over the other? I would love to hear your thoughts. I would also love you to tell me if there were any other themes or given the historical context, any other things that jump out to you about these books. I would love to chat about them. And also let me know if you enjoyed this format of review. I don't know how often I will find books that have so many parallels between them, but I do have a few candidates. So if you liked it, yes, let me know. And as always, if you are enjoying my videos, please subscribe. That would mean a lot to me. And that's all. I will see you on my next video. But until then, goodbye.